Adolf Hitler called this concept heresy. A weapon for cowards was his verdict, and he personally banned the project, ordering his engineers to work on real rifles. But he didn't know that his own generals would resort to government fraud to secretly send a weapon to the front that would become a nightmare for armies across the world. In this film, we'll show you how a weapon born from lies and sabotage made the enemy believe in black magic in its very first battle, and why this losing rifle actually won the most important victory in history by giving birth to the concept behind more than 1 billion assault rifles built worldwide today. Late 1944. The factories of the Third Reich were performing a manufacturing miracle. Despite constant bombing, tens of thousands of brand new Sturmgewehrs were rolling off the assembly lines. Production peaked in December, over 55,000 units in a single month. The machine was running at its absolute limit. Albert Speer could have been pleased. On paper, the Wehrmacht's firepower was growing exponentially. But the paper, as always, was lying. This was agony, disguised as efficiency. Because along with the production of rifles, another, equally important industry was supposed to grow: ammunition production. And it wasn't growing. It was dying. The ammunition plant near Magdeburg. Workers in 3 shifts, under the light of dim emergency lamps, struggled to meet the quota. But every night, bombs rained from the sky. The Allies weren't targeting a specific workshop. They were methodically wiping the entire industrial zone off the face of the earth. Today, the brass warehouse was bombed. Tomorrow, the railway line that delivered gunpowder. The day after, the power station that supplied the entire complex. Rifle production was outpacing ammunition production. The imbalance was becoming catastrophic, and even the few trainloads of precious crates labeled Kurzpatronen often never reached the front. Every bridge, every railway junction was in the crosshairs of attack aircraft. By day, American Thunderbolts; by night, Soviet Night Witches. The Reich's logistical system, once the envy of the world, had been reduced to ruins. The roads were clogged with columns of refugees, the rails, twisted skeletons of burned-out trains. The Sturmgewehr had become an orphan. A weapon born for withering fire was now on starvation rations. April 1945. Berlin. In the cellars of the Reich Chancellery and on barricades made of shattered furniture, the Volkssturm was in its death throes. Old men and boys, the Führer's last reserve. They, the most desperate, were issued the best weapons. An officer, a gray-haired veteran of the First World War, was distributing his meager arsenal. He had a squad of 30 men, and for all of them, 5 Sturmgewehrs. He handed them to 16-year-old boys, their eyes burning with fanatical fire. Along with the rifle, he gave each of them 2 magazines. Just 2. 60 rounds. He looked at a boy struggling to hold the heavy rifle and chuckled bitterly to himself. 60 rounds. At a rate of fire of 500 rounds per minute, that would last for 3 minutes of combat. Maybe 4, if you fired in short bursts. And then what? Then this technological marvel, this pinnacle of engineering, would turn into an expensive, heavy club. He had been given a Stradivarius violin, but no bow. On the other side of the front, in Hungary, elite SS units, retreating under the blows of the Red Army, faced the same problem. Their Sturmgewehrs were deadly. But that deadliness lasted only as long as there were bullets in their pouches. When they ran out, hell began. The newest assault rifles turned into useless scrap metal. Soldiers would drop them and pick up old, reliable Mauser carbines from the dead, for which ammunition could still be found. The collapse was total. The problem wasn't just ammunition. According to regulations, each rifle was supposed to have 6 magazines. But due to the bombing and chaos, soldiers received 3 at best. This further reduced their combat effectiveness in prolonged firefights. The peak of Sturmgewehr production coincided with the peak collapse of the state that created it. The rifles lay in warehouses in Thuringia, hundreds of kilometers from the front, and soldiers in the trenches near Vienna or on the Silo Heights were fighting with their last strength, with only 1 or 2 magazines each. It was the ultimate irony of the war. Germany had created the perfect weapon for a mass army, but by the time they created it, they no longer had a mass army, nor the resources to feed it. The Sturmgewehr arrived at the war just as the war itself was ending. It was like a brilliant doctor arriving to find the patient already dead. Summer of '44, Normandy, the hedgerows, which had become deadly labyrinths. Here, in the bocage, the war had devolved into a series of short, brutal clashes. Death could be waiting behind every bush, around every bend in the road. Kurt Kneipp, a panzer grenadier, was lying at the bottom of a shell crater. His leg burned with pain, shrapnel. His squad was scattered. He was alone, and he was surrounded. He could hear their voices. English, Americans. They were sweeping the area, methodically, step by step. He checked his Sturmgewehr. 1 magazine, and it wasn't even full. Maybe 20 rounds. 20 chances that weren't really chances at all. Against a full patrol, it was nothing. He could surrender. He could wait for them to approach and accept his death in a short, hopeless fight. But Kurt was a veteran, and he knew something the Americans didn't. They didn't know his weapon, but they knew its reputation. Legends were already spreading among the Allies about Hitler's buzzsaw, a weapon that mowed down men like grass, a weapon whose sound meant certain death. And Kurt decided not to use his bullets. He decided to use fear. He waited. He forced himself to breathe evenly, ignoring the pain. He heard them getting closer. 50 meters. 40. Now. He raised himself up, poking the barrel over the edge of the crater. He wasn't aiming. He just pulled the trigger. A short, angry burst. 3 rounds. He saw 2 figures in front of him drop. The rest instantly hit the dirt, pressing themselves into the ground. Kurt immediately rolled to the other side of the crater. He crawled a few meters, taking cover behind some bushes. Fired again. 2 more rounds. Into nothing. Just to make the sound come from a different spot. The Americans didn't advance. They started firing back, spraying lead at the spot where he'd first fired from. They were shouting something to each other. Kurt didn't understand the words, but he understood their intonation. Confusion. Caution. They thought they'd stumbled upon a machine gun crew. A well-fortified position. A single Sturmgewehr, with its sound and rate of fire, created the illusion of an entire squad. Kurt changed his position again, crawled a little further, and fired another short burst. 2 rounds. Just sound. Just a reminder that he was there. He was playing with them. He was the conductor of their fear. He had no more than 10 rounds left in his magazine. 10 notes in his deadly symphony. But their fear was his primary ammunition, and that ammunition supply was inexhaustible. He heard a new sound, the dull thud of a mortar. The Americans weren't going to storm his position. They didn't risk it. Why lose men on a frontal assault against a machine gun nest? It was easier to call in fire support. The mortar rounds began to fall, but they were landing where he had been 10 minutes ago. They were tearing up an empty crater, empty bushes, and Kurt, under the cover of the roar, was crawling. Slowly, painfully, losing consciousness from the pain. But he was crawling away from the death he himself had orchestrated. He survived. He wasn't saved by a hail of fire. He was saved by the reputation of that fire. This was a new tactic, a tactic of desperation, a tactic of survival. Soldiers, realizing the psychological effect of their weapon, began to use it as a tool of deception. With their last magazine in their pocket, they could make the enemy believe they were facing an entire army. A short burst from a Sturmgewehr was worth more than a long speech from a propagandist. It spoke the universal language of war. Do not approach. It is dangerous here. A weapon created for assault had become the perfect tool of defense in the hands of a lone, wounded soldier. Its legend, which outpaced its actual capabilities, became his last, most reliable shield. Kurt Kneipp crawled to safety, and his Sturmgewehr, even in silence, continued to fight for him, keeping the enemy at a distance with its reputation alone. Spring of 1945. The Reich was in its death throes. The front was no longer a line on a map. It had become a bleeding wound, running through every city, every village. And into this wound, they threw the last ones who could still be thrown into battle. Wolfgang Sauer, 17 years old. Just a year ago, he was marching in Hitler Youth parades, singing songs of loyalty and self-sacrifice. Now, he wore an ill-fitting greatcoat and a steel helmet that kept slipping over his eyes. Yesterday's schoolboys, hastily taught to fire a Panzerfaust, were thrown in to plug the gaps in Berlin's defenses. In a half-demolished basement, smelling of dampness and fear, they were issued weapons. Wolfgang was given a Sturmgewehr. He took it in his hands and was astonished by its weight. It felt as if the rifle was heavier than he was. The instructor, an armless veteran, said wearily, "This is the Führer's weapon, a weapon of victory. Take care of it." Wolfgang looked at the rough metal, at the curved magazine. He could smell the grease and gunpowder. This was the smell of victory they had been told so much about. He believed. He had to believe. If he fired this miracle weapon, the enemy would get scared and run away. He didn't want to die. He just wanted them to leave. When a roar echoed and the ground shook from nearby explosions, they were herded to their position, a barricade made of wrecked trams and furniture. Wolfgang saw tanks crawling out from around the street corner, angular, alien, with red stars. Infantry ran behind them. He pressed the stock against his bony shoulder. The first time he fired, it nearly knocked him off his feet. The recoil was strong, and the blast was deafening. But the fear passed. He squeezed the trigger. He wasn't aiming. He was just shooting in the direction of the advancing figures. He didn't know if he hit anyone. He just wanted to create a wall of fire, a wall that would protect him. A few hundred meters away, taking cover behind the shell of a burnt-out truck, lay a Soviet sergeant, a seasoned frontline soldier who had fought his way from Stalingrad to Berlin. He peeked out, assessing the situation. "Look," he said to the young soldier next to him. "Another kid with a new gun." He saw how clumsily the teenager handled the weapon, how the recoil threw him around, how he fired long, pointless bursts, emptying the entire magazine into thin air. The sergeant felt sorry for him. He was just a child, dressed in a uniform and given a toy that was too complicated for him. But orders were orders. "On the left flank," he commanded, "take him." The technological marvel, in the hands of an untrained, terrified youth, became a simple piece of iron. It couldn't replace experience. It couldn't replace tactical training. It couldn't replace the will to live, a will the attackers had, and the defenders no longer did. The Sturmgewehr, conceived as a weapon for elite assault groups, for professionals of war, became the last straw for the drowning. It was mass-issued to old men from the Volkssturm who could barely lift it. and to teenagers from the Hitler Youth who didn't understand its essence. It was the most tragic of paradoxes. The Reich's most advanced weapon ended up in the hands of its weakest defenders. It was created for victory, but became a symbol of agony. It was meant to strike terror into the enemy, but in the hands of these children and old men, it inspired only pity. 2 days later, Wolfgang Sauer was captured. He had run out of ammunition, and his comrades were dead. When a Russian soldier took the Sturmgewehr from him, Wolfgang cried. He wasn't crying out of fear of captivity. He was crying because he had lost the Führer's weapon. He still believed in a miracle. But there are no miracles in war. There is only cold calculation, experience, and steel. And by the spring of '45, Germany's enemies had immeasurably more of all of that. The Sturmgewehr became the weapon of the doomed, the final meaningless gesture of a regime willing to sacrifice even its own children, placing in their hands a symbol of unfulfilled hope. May 1945. The war in Europe is over. A red flag flies over the ruins of Berlin. The battlefields, so recently a living hell, have fallen silent. And on these fields, the victors were gathering the harvest. Thousands of Sturmgewehrs became war trophies. American soldiers curiously examined the strange weapon, took pictures with it, and sent it home as souvenirs. Soviet soldiers collected them more methodically. For them, it wasn't just a souvenir. It was a valuable military and technical document. The weapon that had caused them so many problems now lay in piles at collection points. It was studied, tested, and compared with their own. But the main prize was yet to come, a trophy of flesh and blood. The city of Suhl, Thuringia, the armory capital of Germany. Here, at the Hanel Company factories where the Sturmgewehr was born, men in the uniforms of NKVD officers arrived. They weren't interested in the machines or the blueprints. They were interested in the brain that had created it all. Hugo Schmeisser didn't try to flee to the West, like Werner von Braun with his rocket scientists. He remained in his home, among his papers, like a captain who doesn't abandon a sinking ship. He was no longer the genius of the defeated Reich. He was an asset, a most valuable intellectual resource. The invitation was polite, but refusal was not an option. A Soviet officer, who spoke perfect German, explained to Herr Schmeisser that his experience in the field of automatic weapons, and more importantly, in cold stamping technologies, was of great interest to Soviet industry. He was offered the chance to continue his work in the Soviet Union. For Schmeisser, it was the end of his world. His country lay in ruins. His creation hadn't saved it. His name, once world famous, was now just a line on a list of specialists to be utilized. He had become a trophy, just like his assault rifles. He, his family, and a group of other German engineers set off on a long journey east, to a city he had never heard of, Izhevsk. There, in the Urals, at the very factory where work on a new Soviet assault rifle was already in full swing, the German genius was to share his secrets. He wasn't thrown into a camp. He was given comfortable living conditions and a good salary, but he was in a gilded cage. To the Soviet officer overseeing his relocation, it was crystal clear. This man was a key, the key to a new generation of weapons. His practical experience in stamping could save Soviet designers years of trial and error. While the Americans would be creating their new rifles from solid blocks of steel, the old-fashioned way, the Russians, with the help of German knowledge, would bet on low cost and mass production. Hugo Schmeisser arrived in Izhevsk. He saw the prototypes of the Kalashnikov rifle. He consulted with the engineers. The debates about the extent of his contribution will never cease. Kalashnikov himself always said that the German only helped set up the production technology and had nothing to do with the design. And this is most likely true. The internal mechanisms of the AK and the Sturmgewehr are completely different. But the concept itself, the idea, that was already a trophy. The Soviet Union didn't capture blueprints. It captured a battle-proven idea. The future belonged to the assault rifle using an intermediate cartridge made from stamped steel. Schmeisser spent 7 years in Ijevsk. For 7 years, he passed on his experience to those against whom his weapon was created. In 1952, he was allowed to return to Germany, to the GDR. A year later, he died, broken and forgotten. His fate mirrored that of his creation. The Sturmgewehr didn't disappear either. Thousands of captured rifles entered service in the armies of other countries. In Yugoslavia, they were used to arm paratroopers. In Czechoslovakia, they were studied meticulously. And in East Germany, Schmeisser's homeland, they became the main weapon of the National People's Army and served until the early 60s, until they were finally replaced by the Kalashnikov. The victor's trophy lived on, but under different flags. Its conceptual spirit, its technological soul, had been captured and assimilated. Defeated in the war, it was preparing for its posthumous victory, the victory of an idea over matter. The war was over, but its lessons had yet to be learned. In the Soviet Union, intelligence reports and prisoner interrogations about the Sturmgewehr weren't shelved. On the contrary, they became a catalyst. The concept of the intermediate cartridge was recognized as the only correct path. The entire industrial and intellectual potential of the nation was thrown into creating its own, even more perfect weapon of this class. The German experience, paid for with the blood of Soviet soldiers, was carefully analyzed and taken into account. But on the other side of the new Iron Curtain, a completely different atmosphere prevailed. In the offices of the Pentagon, American intelligence reports on the German assault rifle were also read. They were read with a frown, but they led to completely opposite conclusions. An American general, a veteran of the fighting in Europe, rapped his knuckles on a world map. He thought in global categories. Future wars, it seemed to him, would be fought in the open spaces of Europe, at long ranges, where the decisive factor would be the accuracy and power of the shot. Our soldiers must be able to hit a target at 600 yards, he would say. This is the foundation of marksmanship training. This is our standard. The concept of the Sturmgewehr seemed to him a dangerous compromise. An intermediate cartridge? That's for mass, poorly trained armies that win not by skill, but by numbers, who saturate the enemy with a torrent of lead, hoping for a lucky hit. But the American soldier is a professional. He needs power. He needs a rifle capable of penetrating light cover and stopping an enemy with a single shot. The terror his soldiers had felt in the Ardennes was forgotten. It was written off as a surprise attack, bad weather, the specific conditions of forest combat. It was considered an isolated case, not a systemic lesson. The conclusions of the intelligence officer who, back in '44, wrote about the Germans' zone of total fire superiority were ignored. His cold, calculated warnings remained mere lines in an archive file. The strategists looked at them with the arrogance of victors. Why should we learn from the losers? We won with our M1 Garand rifle. Therefore, our doctrine is correct. And America, followed by the entire NATO bloc, bet on the full-sized, powerful rifle cartridge, 7.62 by 51 millimeters. New battle rifles were created for it, the M14 in the US, the FN FAL in Belgium, the G3 in Germany. Beautiful, accurate, powerful, and completely unsuited for the reality that had already arrived. It was a colossal strategic error. Western generals were preparing for a remake of World War II, but the world was already on the threshold of new types of wars: local conflicts, guerrilla wars in jungles and cities, where the combat distance rarely exceeded 100 meters, where the density of automatic fire was more important than sniper-like accuracy. While American soldiers were lugging heavy rifles with 20-round magazines, whose recoil made automatic fire practically useless, on the other side of the world, Soviet industry was churning out the Kalashnikov assault rifle by the millions. Light, reliable, with a 30-round magazine. The ideal weapon for the wars that would come to define the second half of the 20th century. The Warsaw Pact gained a huge advantage in infantry doctrine, an advantage that lasted for almost 15 years. The irony of history was cruel. The creators of the Sturmgewehr lost the war, but their main adversary in the East immediately learned their revolutionary lesson, while their adversaries in the West, the victors, arrogantly rejected it. They would yet have to pay for this arrogance. Pay with the blood of their soldiers in the swamps and jungles of Vietnam. It was there, faced with thousands of guerrillas armed with light and effective AK-47s, that the American army would realize its mistake in a panic, and in a rush would begin rearming with its own assault rifle chambered for an intermediate cartridge, the M16. But that would come later. For now, in the 50s, the lesson of the Sturmgewehr was ignored. The victors decided they had nothing to learn, and in doing so, they willingly handed the future of small arms over to those who proved to be more diligent students. Over time, rust consumed the metal. The last Sturmgewehrs lived out their days in the warehouses of second-echelon armies, gradually giving way to more modern models. It seemed the story of this weapon, born in fire and agony, had come to an end. The rifle, which had failed to save its creator, was destined to become merely a footnote in military history textbooks, a museum exhibit. But the physical death of the weapon did not mean the death of its soul. The ghost of the Sturmgewehr did not vanish. It simply changed its form. Its concept, its immortal idea, broke free from the prison of stamped steel and began its triumphant march across the planet. Its first incarnation was the Kalashnikov assault rifle. It was not a copy. It was an heir. It took from its German progenitor the very essence: a mass-produced assault rifle for an intermediate cartridge, cheap to manufacture and simple to use. Soviet engineers perfected this idea, creating a weapon so reliable it became the benchmark. And with this weapon in hand, armies and rebels around the world began to fight in a new way, by the rules written by Hugo Schmeisser's engineers back in 1942. Then, with a 15-year delay, the West also learned its lesson. Faced with reality in the jungles of Vietnam, the U.S. military was forced to acknowledge the correctness of the German concept. Thus, the M16 rifle was born. A different design, different materials, a different cartridge. But at its core lay the very same idea: to give every soldier a light, automatic weapon, effective at medium combat ranges. The Sturmgewehr had achieved its goal. It forced both superpowers to adopt its faith. And today, decades later, its legacy is everywhere. Every soldier on the planet, from a U.S. Special Forces operator in Afghanistan to a rebel in the African savannah, holds a descendant of the Sturmgewehr 44. Forms change, calibers evolve, but the essence remains the same. The concept of the assault rifle has become the global standard, undeniable, the only one possible. Look at any infantryman in any army in the world. He is not armed with a powerful long-range rifle nor with a compact submachine gun. He is armed with their hybrid, their compromise, their brilliant synthesis. He is armed with the idea of the Sturmgewehr. The British captain, Lionel West, who at Arnhem in '44 couldn't understand where the Germans were getting so many machine guns, lived to a ripe old age. And he saw on television the footage of wars in Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East. And he saw that the wall of fire, which once seemed to him a diabolical invention of the SS, had become commonplace. This was now how everyone fought. The German grenadier, Hans Richter, who on a nameless hill on the Eastern Front first felt that intoxicating sense of power, survived. And he knew that the feeling he had experienced did not die with the Third Reich. It simply changed its flag. It was passed down to millions of other soldiers who had never heard his name. The Sturmgewehr 44 did not win the war. It did not save the Nazi regime. It was too late for its own battle, but it won the future. It lost tactically, but it achieved a crushing conceptual victory. This is not a story about a weapon that lost. This is the story of how a losing army gave the world a weapon that forever changed the face of war, and therein lies its main, tragic paradox. A weapon born of lies, nurtured by desperation, and buried beneath the rubble of an empire, found immortality. Its body has decayed, but its spirit lives on, in every assault rifle, on every battlefield, to this very day. The year is 1945, the city of Seoul. The heart of Germany's arms industry lies in ruins. Amidst the rubble stands a man whose name was once synonymous with power, Hugo Schmeisser. Genius, designer, and now, the grand prize of the defeated Reich. His country is destroyed. His latest creation, the weapon that was meant to be its hope, failed to save it. Now he himself has become the spoils. Polite men in foreign uniforms don't ask. They invite. His knowledge, his experience, his entire life dedicated to metal and gunpowder, would now serve those he had designed his weapons against. For him, the war wasn't over. It had simply changed its battlefield, from the trenches to a drafting table in a foreign land. But just a few years ago, everything was different. Then, in the workshops of the Haenel Company, the air was electrified not with despair, but with anticipation. Here, under Schmeisser's leadership, the future was being born. He saw what the generals did not. He understood the fundamental lie of modern warfare. The infantryman was torn in two. In his hands was either the Mauser carbine, a powerful, accurate, but slow weapon, born in the trenches of the First World War. One shot, work the bolt, another shot, perfect for a duel at 800 meters. But battles were no longer fought at such distances, or the soldier had an MP-40 submachine gun, a storm of fire, a wall of lead that swept away everything within 100 meters. But beyond that line, it was useless. Between 100 and 400 meters lay a dead zone, the space where 80% of all firefights took place. And in this zone, only one god ruled, the machine gun. The common soldier here was either a target or a spectator. Schmeisser decided to commit heresy. He decided to give every man power over this zone. His idea was simple and brilliant. The problem wasn't the rifle, but the cartridge. The powerful rifle cartridge was excessive. It could hit a target 2 kilometers away when a soldier could see the enemy at 400 meters at best. This excess power made automatic fire from a handheld weapon uncontrollable. Schmeisser proposed a compromise. Create a shorter cartridge, lighter, with a smaller powder charge, a cartridge weaker than a rifle's, but far more powerful than a pistol's, an intermediate cartridge, and with it, a completely new weapon. The Reich's industrialists tapped their temples. This was madness. The core of a weapon, the barrel and the receiver, was always milled from solid blocks of the finest steel. It was tradition, a guarantee of quality. Schmeisser, however, proposed making them from sheet metal, using a cold stamping method, like kitchenware. To them, it was sacrilege, cheap, unreliable, risky. In a total war, they couldn't afford a failure. But Schmeisser and his engineers saw a different picture. Stamping meant speed, low cost, mass production. Manufacturing one rifle required 14 man-hours, not 20 like the old carbine. It used almost a third less of the scarce metal. Reich Minister of Armaments Albert Speer, a pragmatist and a technocrat, supported the project. He saw not an ugly stamped piece of metal, but the only opportunity to quickly and cheaply multiply the infantry's firepower. And so, in 1942, the prototype was ready. The Maschinenkarabiner, 42. It was not elegant. Rough welds, angular shapes. It didn't look like a noble weapon. It looked like a tool, the perfect tool for killing. When Hugo Schmeisser held it in his hands, he didn't feel the cold of the metal. He felt the pulse of a new era, a long-stroke gas piston, a tilting bolt locking mechanism, a 30-round magazine, the ability to fire in single shots or in bursts. In this piece of stamped steel lived his dream, the dream of a soldier who would no longer be a victim, of a soldier who would become a machine gun crew of one. He believed he was creating a weapon of victory, a weapon that would change the rules of war. He didn't know that his creation was born too late, and that its true immortal life would only begin after the flags of his country were thrown into the mud. In the hall, saturated with the smell of cigar smoke and expensive leather, the future lay on a velvet table. Engineers with burning eyes demonstrated their creation to the high command. They spoke of tactical superiority, of saving resources, of a new era in infantry combat. They believed that logic and numbers were irrefutable, that anyone who saw this rifle would understand. This was a revolution. But they were speaking to the ghosts of the past. The generals, whose glory was forged in swift tank charges, looked at the stamped steel with poorly concealed contempt. Where was the nobility of milled parts? Where was the elegance of a classic weapon? This looked like something made from a drainpipe. But the opinion of one man was decisive: Adolf Hitler, a veteran of the trenches of the First World War, a man for whom the image of the soldier was carved in the granite of his own memories. He didn't see a weapon. He saw heresy. A soldier, in his conviction, must be a marksman, accurate, disciplined, raised on the doctrine of a precise shot from a Mauser carbine, every round on target. It was a philosophy born in trench warfare, where the price of a mistake was high and ammunition was limited. And this was a weapon of panic, a weapon for cowards who can't aim and just spray lead everywhere, hoping for a lucky hit. He saw in this not progress, but a degradation of the warrior spirit. Supporters of the project, like Albert Speer, tried to object. They spoke the language of numbers, that the new rifle was cheap, that it saved precious man-hours, that it gave the soldier a tool for combat at the ranges where most battles unfolded, that the Führer's thinking was stuck in the past. But Hitler heard only what he wanted to hear. He saw another kind of threat in the new weapon, a logistical one. The front already had three main types of infantry ammunition: rifle, pistol, high caliber for anti-tank rifles. Introducing a fourth, completely new Kurz cartridge seemed like madness to him. That meant new production lines, new crates, a new headache for a supply system that was already cracking under the strain of Allied air raids and partisan sabotage. Why create chaos for a weapon of questionable ideological value? He didn't understand, or refused to understand, that the very fabric of war had changed. That classic marksmanship duels had given way to fierce, short-range clashes in city ruins and dense forests, where the deciding factor wasn't the accuracy of one shot, but the volume of fire in the next second. His verdict was short and absolute. Shut down the project. Cease all work. Divert resources to the production of the tried-and-true Carabiner 98 carbines and MG-42 machine guns. He didn't want to compromise. He wanted either sniper-like precision or the hurricane of fire from a machine gun. Nothing in between. For the engineers and far-sighted officers, it was a death sentence. Not for the weapon, but for common sense. They watched as their future, their hard-won hope, was carried away from the table. They saw how thousands of their soldiers' lives would be sacrificed to an obsolete dogma. Precious time, which could never be recovered, was slipping through their fingers. The engineer's hope clashed with the dictator's will, and the dictator's will won. The project was dead, killed by a single word. At least, that's what everyone thought. Silence reigned in the corridors of the Wehrmacht Ordnance Office, but it was the silence of conspiracy. The Führer's order was law. To disobey it meant signing your own death warrant. The assault rifle project was officially buried. All blueprints, all prototypes were to be sent to the archives, to be covered in the dust of oblivion. But there were men who saw reality not from a bunker in East Prussia, but from the bloody mud of the Eastern Front. Officers who read the dispatches, engineers who understood the logic of combat. They knew Hitler had made a catastrophic mistake, a mistake that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives, and they decided to do the unthinkable, to commit state forgery, to directly deceive the Supreme Commander. This wasn't a rebellion. It was an act of desperate patriotism. They didn't question the Führer's authority. They questioned his competence on a matter upon which the survival of the common soldier depended. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. If the Führer hated the new rifle but loved submachine guns, then they had to give him a submachine gun, at least on paper. The conspirators began their game. They took the shuttered Maschinen- and Carabiner project and simply renamed it. The new name was a masterpiece of bureaucratic mimicry. MP-43, Maschinenpistole, submachine gun, model of 43. To any inspector from the party chancellery, it all looked logical. There was the successful MP-40. So, the MP-43 must be its next upgrade. A slightly different shape, a different stock, insignificant details. No one would delve into the type of cartridge or the principle of its automatic operation. The main thing was the name. It was the perfect cover. Under this new banner, the Phantom Project came back to life. The machines were not stopped. Production did not cease. It simply went into the shadows. Now, instead of a revolutionary rifle, the factories in Suhl and Erfurt were officially producing an improved submachine gun. The risk was colossal. This wasn't just professional negligence. This was high treason. If the deception were discovered, heads would roll. The Gestapo didn't ask unnecessary questions, but the thrill was too great. Every new rifle that came off the assembly line under a false name was a small victory over the dictator's stubbornness. They understood this couldn't go on forever. Their goal wasn't just to secretly produce the weapon. Their goal was to prove its worth where orders and dogmas don't apply, on the battlefield. The first batch had to be sent to the front as soon as possible, into the very inferno, and to get feedback from there, not from generals, from lieutenants and sergeants, from those who look the enemy in the eye. The conspirators believed If combat reports proved the weapon's staggering effectiveness, even the Führer couldn't deny the obvious. Victory on the battlefield was to be their alibi, their only justification. And so, under a cloak of lies and bureaucratic trickery, thousands of brand-new MP-43s were being prepared for shipment. Every crate, marked with the innocent abbreviation, was a time bomb planted under the foundation of the Third Reich's military doctrine. No one knew what would happen when that bomb exploded, but all the conspirators understood one thing: there was no turning back. They had staked their careers and their lives on a weapon they believed in more than the wisdom of their leader. 1943, the Eastern Front, a vast, scorched earth soaked in blood and hatred. Here, in the hell of trench warfare, a man had two roles: to kill or be killed. Hans Richter, a grenadier, lay in a shallow trench at the foot of a nameless hill. The ground trembled from nearby explosions. A thick howl hung in the air. The Russians were attacking again. He clutched his new weapon, heavy, angular, unlike the familiar, elegant Mauser. They called it the MP-43. They were told it was a new submachine gun. But Hans felt it. This was something else. He remembered his previous attacks. You take one shot, frantically work the bolt, ejecting the hot casing. Try to catch the next figure in your sights. Another shot. And still they come. They come in waves. And the feeling of helplessness, the clammy fear of a dead man walking, trying to bail out the sea with a thimble. But today was different. When the first wave of Soviet infantry rose from their trenches and flooded the field, Hans didn't aim at a single man. He switched the fire selector to automatic, pressed the stock to his shoulder, and pulled the trigger. The weapon came alive. It didn't kick his shoulder with the malice of a rifle. It trembled, it rumbled, steady, powerful, controlled. A dull, businesslike roar, unlike anything he had ever heard before. He just swept the barrel from left to right in short bursts of 3 or 4 rounds, and he saw a miracle. The figures ahead were falling, not one, not two. They fell like scythed grass. At a distance of 300, 400 meters, where his old carbine gave him one chance, this weapon gave him dozens. Where a submachine gun was useless, it sowed death. The fear was gone. In its place came an intoxicating, dark feeling, a feeling of power. He was no longer a target. He was a predator. He alone was worth 10 men. He was no longer bailing out the sea. He was a wall of fire against which the waves crashed. At that very moment, a few hundred meters away, on the other side of no man's land, a Red Army lieutenant was trying to rally his men for an attack, and he couldn't understand what was happening. He was used to German tactics. First, the MG-42 machine gun would fire, its terrifying Hitler's buzzsaw. But you could spot it, suppress it with mortars. Then the submachine guns would chatter, but their fire wasn't a threat beyond 150 meters. And the rifles were just single pinpricks you could take cover from in a crater. But now, something unimaginable was happening. The fire was dense, almost like a machine gun, but it wasn't coming from a single point. It was coming from everywhere, from every German trench. Dozens, hundreds of bursts lashed his men from a distance where only rifles should have been firing. How? Where did they get so many light machine guns? This wasn't an attack. It was an extermination. Soldiers were falling before they even reached the middle of the field. They couldn't lift their heads. They were pinned to the ground by a lead rain that seemed to come from every bush, from every hole. The lieutenant screamed into the field telephone, "Fire! Heavy automatic fire! They have new machine guns. Every infantryman has one. We can't advance. I repeat, we can't advance." The attack had faltered. That evening, in a silence broken only by the moans of the wounded, Hans Richter cleaned his new weapon. He looked at it with a superstitious respect. This crude, stamped steel had saved his life. It had given him what a soldier dreams of more than anything else in the world: a chance. The baptism by fire was complete, and on both sides of the front, a new knowledge was born. For some, it was the knowledge of newfound power. For others, the knowledge of a new, inexplicable terror. Its name was the MP-43, the weapon that officially did not exist. In the command dugouts of the Red Army, bewilderment was growing, turning into alarm. Reports, each one like the last, landed on commanders' desks. Reports in which unconcealed terror bled through the dry language of military summaries. Reconnaissance groups, returning from behind enemy lines, reported something strange. Captured German soldiers, taken in the trenches, were increasingly armed not with carbines or submachine guns, but with something in between. A weapon with a long, curved magazine, like a hybrid of a rifle and an automatic weapon. But it was the reports from the front lines that sowed real panic. Company and battalion commanders wrote of battles that defied all military science. The enemy halted our advance with the strength of a single squad. A platoon was pinned down by fire from a single trench. The assault was thwarted by a hail of fire from a distance of 300 to 400 meters, presumably not from machine gun crews, but from individual riflemen. This was impossible. It broke all tactical doctrines. An infantry squad, armed with Mosin rifles and a single Degtyaryov light machine gun, could not withstand such fire. To create such a density of fire, the Germans would need to have a machine gun in every soldier's hands. And that was absurd. But the facts were stubborn, and the most terrifying fact was the casualties. Even Smirnov, a company commander, would never forget the battle for that tiny village. On the outskirts stood a stone shed, which the Germans had turned into a pillbox, a bunker. Fire poured from it, ceaseless, accurate. His company charged 3 times, and 3 times they were driven back, leaving dozens of dead and wounded on the frozen ground. Smirnov was certain. An MG-42 crew was dug in there. He had heard that sound 1,000 times, but something was off. The sound was different, more muffled, not as hysterical as Hitler's buzzsaw, and the bursts were shorter, as if the machine gunner was conserving ammunition. They called in artillery. After several direct hits from a 45mm gun, the shed fell silent. When Smirnov's men burst inside, they froze. Among the shattered bricks and smoldering beams lay a body. Just one German soldier, and next to him, that same strange, curved rifle. 1 man, 1 automatic rifle. For 3 hours, he held off the advance of an entire company, 120 men. Smirnov looked at the weapon, and his hatred for the enemy mixed with a cold, professional respect and fear. What if every one of them had a weapon like this? How could they fight then? Stories like this multiplied. They became shrouded in rumors and legends. Soldiers on the front lines whispered about the Fritz's new wonder weapon, about an automatic carbine that could fire bursts up to half a kilometer. They said its bullets could pierce the parapet of a trench, that a single rifleman with one could stop a tank. This was a lie, of course, but it was a lie born of truth, the truth of the helplessness and terror a soldier felt when caught in a fire of unseen power. Reconnaissance was given an order: acquire a sample, at any cost. The new automatic rifle became a priority target. Snipers hunted for it. The best scouts were sent on night raids for it. The command wanted to know what they were up against. It wasn't just a weapon. In the eyes of Soviet soldiers, it was becoming something more. a symbol of the enemy's power, an almost animate evil. They didn't yet know its real name. They didn't know that its creators had deceived their own Führer. They knew only one thing. Wherever that muffled staccato sound began, the earth turned to hell. One German sniper, later captured, would say during his interrogation, "I was in my hideout alone, but as long as I had ammunition for my MP-44, I felt like this was my personal Stalingrad, and they would not pass." He was wrong. They passed. But the price of that breakthrough, paid under the fire of the new weapon, was terrible. It wasn't black magic. It was simply engineering genius. But for those lying under the bullets, there was no difference. Summer, 1944. The Führer's headquarters, the Wolf's Lair. The air in the bunker was stale, heavy with tension, and a premonition of catastrophe. The Eastern Front was cracking at the seams. The Allies had landed in Normandy. The ring around the Reich was tightening. At the daily briefing, one of the generals, growing bold, began to speak of a new weapon. He read enthusiastic reports from the front, reports on the incredible effectiveness of the MP-43 submachine gun, about how handfuls of soldiers armed with it were holding back battalions, about how the soldiers were demanding only this weapon. Hitler listened, his face darkening. MP-43? A modernization of the submachine gun? He demanded to be shown this weapon. When the rifle was brought into the room, he understood everything at once. This was not a submachine gun. It was that rifle, that heretical concept he had personally forbidden a year ago. He had been deceived by his own generals, by his armaments office. They had disobeyed his direct order. Rage distorted his features. He leaped to his feet, unleashing a torrent of accusations at those present. Treason, sabotage, betrayal. He screamed that he wasn't being informed, that he was being led by the nose. In the icy silence of the bunker, his voice sounded like a death sentence. It seemed as though heads were about to roll. But then, something strange happened. The general, without losing his composure, continued his report. He didn't make excuses. He spoke with facts. He presented dispatches in which officers from the front begged for more of these wonderful automatic rifles. He quoted the testimony of prisoners who admitted they feared this weapon more than machine guns. He laid out calculations on the table, proving that the MP-43 was not only more effective, but also cheaper to produce than the old carbine. Hitler fell silent. He took the weapon in his hands. He turned it over, felt its weight, its crude utilitarian power. He was a dictator. He was a paranoid. But he was not a fool. He knew how to recognize strength. And in that moment, his fury, like a flash of magnesium, was replaced by its opposite. Rapture. He didn't see deception. He saw a result. A stunning one. A brilliant one. This weapon worked. It won battles. It sowed terror in the enemy's ranks. All his dogmas about a soldier's marksmanship crumbled to dust in the face of this crude, stamped metal truth. "Brilliant," he exclaimed, and his voice, which moments ago had thundered with rage, now rang with excitement. Why wasn't I told about this wonder weapon sooner? The conspirators, standing before him as pale as death, let out a collective mental sigh of relief. They weren't just forgiven. They had become heroes. Hitler immediately recognized the propaganda potential of the moment. The name MP-43 was too dry, too technical. This weapon, a breakthrough weapon, needed a name that would sound like a battle cry, a name that would become a weapon in itself. He thought for only a second. We will call it the Sturmgewehr, the assault rifle. That name held everything: aggression, onslaught, the ideology of the stormtroopers who were meant to crush the enemy. It wasn't just a name, It was a new tactical doctrine born on the spot. The order followed immediately. Produce it, as fast as possible, with all available resources. First and foremost, for the best, most proven units, for the Waffen-SS, for the Panzergrenadiers, for those who would become the tip of his last desperate spear. The triumph of the Sturmgewehr's creators was complete. They had risked everything and won. Bureaucratic barriers collapsed. The project was given the highest priority. But in a corner of the room stood a general who did not share the universal elation. He looked at the map, on which red arrows moved inexorably toward Germany's borders, and he thought, too late. A year. A whole year had been lost due to the stubbornness of one man. A year in which they could have produced hundreds of thousands of these rifles, retrained the army, created stockpiles of ammunition. Now, even if the factories performed a miracle and produced 1 million Sturmgewehrs, what was the point? Where would they get the ammunition for them when Allied bombers were wiping industrial centers off the face of the earth? How could they deliver them to the front when every bridge, every railway junction was in their sights? The Führer's elation was great, but he could no longer cancel out reality. The wonder weapon had been given the green light, but it was entering a war that was already all but lost. December 1944. The Ardennes forest, ancient trees covered in heavy snow, witnessed Hitler's last great gamble in the West. German tank columns, like ghosts from a glorious past, tore through the weak American defenses. Among these ghosts marched a new generation of soldiers, Panzergrenadiers armed with Sturmgewehrs. For the American GIs, caught by surprise in this snow-covered hell, it was a clash with more than just the enemy. It was a clash with a new reality of combat. Sergeant Bill Preston was leading his squad down a frozen firebreak. The silence was broken only by the crunch of snow underfoot. And suddenly, the forest came alive. It wasn't the familiar crack of single shots from Mausers, nor the hysterical chatter of submachine guns. This was a new sound, steady, deadly, like the hum of a working machine. It came from everywhere, from behind every tree, from behind every snowdrift. Preston's men were falling without even realizing where the fire was coming from. Their M1 Garand rifles, a superb weapon for open country, were clumsy and slow here in the forest. 8 shots and a painstaking reload of the clip, accompanied by a telltale ping that screamed to the enemy, "I'm empty." The American M1 carbines were lighter, but their weak bullets lost all their energy hitting the frozen tree trunks. Thompson submachine guns were effective, but only at grenade-throwing distance. But the Germans were killing them from 200, 300 meters, from a distance where the Americans couldn't effectively fight back. They were trapped in a kill zone created by a weapon for which this forest was the ideal battlefield. Bill Preston lay behind a fallen tree, pressing himself into the snow. He heard that sound, and he knew. They were about to be methodically slaughtered. Among his soldiers, the weapon had already earned a nickname, Hitler's buzzsaw, and that sound instilled a primal terror. On the other side of the firebreak lay a German Panzergrenadier. He was 19. In his hands was a Sturmgewehr 44. He didn't see specific targets. He saw muzzle flashes, saw panicked shadows darting about, and he simply fired in short, aimed bursts. He felt like the master of this forest. The Americans seemed helpless to him. Good soldiers, brave. But their weapons were made for a different war. In this forest, where every tree was cover and every clearing a firing line, he dictated the rules. Everyone in his squad was a machine gunner. Their fire weaved together into a single, impenetrable net. Once, a group of 12 such grenadiers ambushed an entire American company. They took up positions on a hillside, and after letting the enemy get closer, opened fire simultaneously. They constantly changed positions, firing from different points. It seemed to the Americans that they were being attacked by a battalion. The withering fire, coming from all sides, demoralized them. They didn't stand and fight. They ran, leaving dozens of their comrades on the snow, stained crimson. The Ardennes offensive was doomed from the start. The Germans had no fuel to reach their objective, no air support. But in these forest battles, in the tactical clashes of squads and platoons, the Sturmgewehr celebrated its triumph. It proved its complete, undeniable superiority. It became the ideal weapon for forest warfare. This was its finest hour. A short, bright flash against the backdrop of the Third Reich's fading flame. The soldiers armed with it felt like supermen. They were making up for months of retreats and defeats. They were hunters once again. But the snow in the Ardennes was melting, and with it, Germany's last hopes were melting too. The Sturmgewehr's finest hour was coming to an end. Ahead lay only mud, despair, and agony. Far from the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, in the quiet offices of London and Washington, another war was being fought. A war of analysts. On the desks of intelligence officers lay captured trophies, strange, angular German assault rifles. They were disassembled to the last screw, studied under microscopes, and test-fired on ranges. Beside them lay stacks of reports, prisoner interrogation transcripts, and intercepted radio messages. From this chaos of information, a cold, sobering truth was emerging. An American intelligence analyst sat over another report. He didn't hear the whistle of bullets. He didn't smell the scent of gunpowder. His weapons were numbers, tables, and graphs, and they painted a picture of a complete tactical failure. On the ballistic charts, the gap was clearly visible. The M3 submachine gun, the American grease gun, was effective up to 100 yards. Beyond that, its heavy bullet lost energy rapidly. The M1 Garand rifle began to show its true strength past 400 yards. And between 100 and 400 yards, the distance where the fate of most firefights was decided, there was a yawning gap. And it was precisely this gap that the German MP-44, or Sturmgewehr as it was now called, filled. Its Kurz cartridge was the ideal compromise. It created what the analyst, in dry technical terms, called a zone of total fire superiority. In the report he was preparing for high command, there were no emotions, only facts. The enemy weapon, identified as the MP-44, represents a serious threat. It combines the rate of fire of a submachine gun with range and accuracy approaching that of a rifle. A soldier armed with the MP-44 has a clear fire superiority over a soldier with an M1 Garand in close combat, and over a soldier with an M1 carbine or a Thompson submachine gun at medium ranges. The phrases were precise and lifeless, but behind each one stood human lives. Clear fire superiority meant that an American soldier, facing a German grenadier armed with a Sturmgewehr, was at a distinct disadvantage from the outset. The report's conclusion was direct and stark. It is recommended to avoid open engagements with enemy groups armed with this weapon at ranges of 100 to 400 yards. A change in tactics is required, using our advantage in artillery and armor to suppress such units before entering small arms combat. It was an admission, a quiet, bureaucratic one, but no less significant for it. Enemy intelligence had officially admitted. The Germans had created something for which the Allies had no adequate answer. They had made a technological leap that called the entire doctrine of infantry combat into question. British Captain Lionel West, who had miraculously survived the hell of Operation Market Garden at Arnhem, was reading a similar report. For him, these weren't just numbers. He remembered. He remembered that incredibly dense, murderous fire that pinned his men to the ground in the ruins of Dutch cities. His soldiers were dying, not understanding how it was possible. They thought they had been ambushed by dozens of machine gunners. The analysts in the report confirmed his worst fears. This wall of fire wasn't created by machine guns. It was created by the individual rifles of single soldiers. Each one of them was a fire point. In the reports, it was dry statistics. At Arnhem, it was hell. Soviet intelligence came to the same conclusions. Captured Sturmgewehrs were carefully studied at the main artillery directorate. The specialists instantly recognized the revolutionary nature of the concept. In their reports, they called it a new type of weapon. A weapon that solved the very same problem Soviet designers were grappling with: how to give an infantryman the power of a machine gun in a rifle-sized package. The Germans had solved it first, and this was a bitter but honest admission. They admitted defeat in this specific technological race. They acknowledged the genius of the German gunsmiths, but this acknowledgement changed nothing. Armadas of Allied bombers were flying towards German cities. Millions of Soviet soldiers were preparing for the final assault. The Sturmgewehr had won the tactical battle on the drawing boards and the firing ranges. It earned the cold respect of enemy analysts, but it lost the main war, the war of resources, time, and strategy. Its recognition became its epitaph. Autumn of '43. The Eastern Front had once again turned into a bottomless sea of mud. A cold, grueling rain mixed Russian earth with blood, turning the battlefields into a sticky, sucking quagmire. It wasn't just the hope for a quick victory that died in this mud. Faith in the flawlessness of German engineering was dying there too. Paul Weber, a grenadier, had received his new MP-43 assault rifle just a week ago. During training behind the lines, in clean and dry conditions, the weapon worked like a Swiss watch. He admired its power, its rate of fire. Like everyone else, he had bought into the legend of the wonder weapon. Reality was different. Reality smelled of rotting leaves and death. During a counterattack, his squad was running across a sodden field. Paul slipped and fell, plunging his rifle into the liquid mud. He quickly wiped it with his sleeve, cursed, and ran on. When they stormed the first line of Soviet trenches, he raised his weapon to fire a burst at the scurrying figures. Click. He pulled the trigger again. Another dry, dead click. Jammed. A lump of damned Russian earth, lodged in the bolt assembly, had paralyzed the complex mechanism. While he frantically tried to rack the bolt, his friend Franz ran past him. He had the same problem. Paul saw Franz, in desperation, scream with rage and helplessness. He was hitting the bolt of his brand new rifle with the buttstock, trying to force it to work. The next second, a Soviet soldier leaped out from around a bend in the trench. A short bayonet thrust, and Franz fell into the mud, face down. Paul was luckier. He managed to draw his pistol. He survived that day. But something inside him broke. That evening, sitting in a damp dugout, he cleaned his rifle. And he hated it. Hated it as much as he hated the enemy. They were promised a weapon of victory, and it had betrayed him at the most crucial moment. It had killed his friend. This piece of stamped metal, so effective on paper, turned out to be fragile and temperamental in real combat. Paul's tragedy was not an isolated incident. Alarming reports poured in from all over the Eastern Front. The gas-operated mechanism, so simple and reliable in theory, was sensitive to contamination. The tilting bolt required cleanliness and good lubrication, a luxury unavailable in trench life. But the main Achilles heel was the magazine. Made from thin sheet steel to cheapen production, it was unforgivably fragile. Any dent in its body from a fall or a blow would cause the cartridges to misalign and fail to feed. The spring was weak, and experienced soldiers quickly learned not to load the magazine to full capacity, 25 rounds instead of 30. That was the maximum at which one could still hope for reliable operation. 5 rounds, the price of reliability. The engineers back home, in their clean design bureaus, knew about these problems. They knew the weapon was raw, that it needed refinement, testing, and design changes. But they had no time. The front demanded rifles. Now, any kind, as long as they could shoot, and the factories churned them out, sacrificing quality for quantity. The Sturmgewehr was a brilliant concept, born in haste. It was like a race car forced to drive off-road. Its delicate mechanics couldn't withstand the collision with the brutal reality of war. Every jammed bolt, every misfed round was a small tragedy. And out of thousands of these small tragedies, a great defeat was forged. The soldiers lost faith. They had been handed a Stradivarius violin, only to find that it went out of tune in the damp and broke from the slightest impact. And in the roar of battle, what they often needed wasn't a violin, but a simple, reliable club, like the old, proven Mauser carbine, which always fired. In the mud, in the snow, in the fire. The tragedy in the mud was a tragedy of unfulfilled expectations. The wonder weapon turned out to be just a mechanism, complex, temperamental, deadly, but vulnerable, just like the men who held it in their hands. Thus ended the story of the Sturmgewehr, a weapon born of deception and dying in the agony of the Third Reich. But its physical death was merely the beginning of its idea's immortality, a paradoxical triumph for the loser, whose conceptual genius would define the face of warfare for decades to come. What, in the end, is more important? The army that won the war, or the idea that would change it forever? And can a brilliant creation, made in the service of evil, ultimately bring anything other than destruction? There are no simple answers to these questions, but it is in discussing them that understanding is born. Share your thoughts in the comments. That will be the best reward for our work. And if this story made you think, your like and subscription to the channel will be a signal to us that we are moving in the right direction.